Hi everyone, my name is Atila and today I'm going to show how to paint this Malediction figure. I hope you find this tutorial very useful and let's go!
So let's start with Grey Primer. The idea is to use washes and speed paints to build up the shadows and midtones, and then bring those juicy texture later with some dry brushing. For the first wash, I'm using Agnar's Earth Shade from Games Workshop. I'll apply it over all areas that look like bones or horns. Now for the body, especially the lower areas, I'm using Drakenhof Nightshade from Games Workshop, a dark blue wash. The goal is to introduce some cooler shadows. Now I'm applying sepia wash to the gold details. I'm also applying it to the claws. And to the teeth as well. Inside the mouth, I'm applying Volupus Pink from Games Workshop. I wasn't planning paint it entirely pink at first, but it just felt right, and I decided to go with a more flashy, raw look to the monster. The dark blue wash we applied earlier really helps tie everything together here. Now I'm going back to sepia wash, applying it to the human-like figure inside. Now I'm using a mix of wine red and white, both from Ionic. The idea is to rough highlight some areas, almost like a sketch. Some people call this overbrushing. The goal is to preserve the deeper areas so we can keep those shadows intact. If you accidentally cover all shadows in a specific area, try removing some of the paint with a damp brush while still wet. If it's already dry, just go back and repaint the area. For the horns and bones, let's go with a more traditional dry brush. I'm using the color Bone from Ionic. The difference here is that we're using much less paint on the brush and making several quick passes over the same area, slowly building up the highlights. So why am I not using overbrush here or vice versa? Well, you can definitely use either technique on any area, but for the purposes of showing two different approaches on the same miniature, I'm doing half with one method and a half with the other. If at any point you decide to load the brush with a bit more paint, you will notice the highlights becoming more pronounced. Just be careful to not overdo it. I'm applying a base layer using Dwarf Skin from Ionic. The goal is to apply in a way that creates a bit of texture. Now that the pink overbrush has dried, I noticed we lost quite a bit of saturation. So let's bring that back using magenta ink from Liquitex. The idea is to create a glaze by diluting ink with water. The more you dilute it, the more subtle the color becomes. Also important to mention that I'm not covering every pink area. I'm intentionally preserving some of the brighter pinks so we can maintain those highlights. Another way to control the saturation is by reapplying additional layers to specific areas. The more layers you build up, more saturated the color becomes. Now let's apply a sepia wash over the bones and horns. Now let's enhance some of the shadows using the dark purple wash. At this point, I also added a pink layer to the figure inside the mouth. Now let's use some red washes to push the saturation even further. So what's the difference between a wash and a glaze? It really comes down to how you apply it. Washes are usually applied more generously, allowing the paint to flow into the recesses. Glazes or filters are applied much more subtly, with far less paint loaded onto the brush. In this case though, things are a bit different. Since we're working on a highly textured miniature, the line between a wash and a glaze becomes a little blurred. But if I have to choose, I would say this behaves more like a wash. At some point I will also apply this glaze to the figure inside the mouth. And yes, when applying it to the figure, I would say it behaves more like a glaze or a filter rather than a wash. Now I'm using the color Bone from Ionic. The idea here is to pick up some highlights using a very small amount of paint on the brush. By doing this, we're bringing some contrast back to the piece. Sometimes it might feel like a waste of time, but going back and forth like this is completely normal during the painting process. I find it more useful to show these changes in direction and the reworking on certain areas, because that's what really happens in practice. I could easily present a clean, perfectly linear process where everything flows in one direction, but that rarely reflects the reality. Most of the time, as an artist, you are making decisions on the fly and adjusting things as you go. And the proof of that comes in the next step, where I started using turquoise. To add a bit of hue variation to the palette, I'm painting these areas with the turquoise contrast paint. And to be honest, I'm not entirely sure what this part of the miniature is supposed to represent. Then I simply decided to add a bit more of that turquoise in other areas. I started placing it wherever I felt it would look interesting and enhance the overall composition. And once again, this is an example of how trying something new can lead to the change that ultimately enhances the overall look of the piece. Of course, it could have gone the other way. That's why I started on a small area first, and then I gradually moved to other parts. Also at this point, you can see the red glaze applied to the figure inside the mouth. Now I'm using metallic gold from Ionic. Using black from Ionic, I'm adding a few thin lines to separate some of the details, especially in areas where the hues are very similar. Here I'm starting to build slightly lighter layers using gnome skin from Ionic. I'm applying the paint using stippling. Using Bone from Ionic, I'm applying some highlights and edge highlights. So take your time and inspect every part of the miniature, because edge highlights make a big difference. Now I'm using turquoise from Ionic mainly to better cover the areas where the turquoise contrast paint didn't apply evenly. And then I had another idea. What if I used this color to draw some veins? For better control, I used a very thin size 0 brush. Back to the figure inside, I'm highlighting with elf skin from Ionic. To soften some of the transitions, I'm creating different glazes by mixing elf skin or gnome skin with red and sometimes adding a touch of phthalo blue from Ionic for the shadows. For the base, I'm using Agrar's Earth Shade from GW. After the wash dried, I applied some turquoise contrast paint, and while it was still wet, I added some voluptuous pink contrast, letting the two colors blend slightly while both are still fresh. And with that, my friends, we come to the end of this tutorial. I hope you found it helpful, and I'll see you in the next time.